You're watching Reason Live, streaming to you from Los Angeles. The following is a live, unedited conversation between the host, the guest, and the online audience. If you'd like to participate, please leave your question in the YouTube chat. The views expressed by guests and the audience members in this discussion do not necessarily reflect those of Reason. And now your host, Zach Weissmuller.
Hello, thank you for joining us for day 3 of this live stream experiment. Today we're going to be talking with Rick Doblin of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And if you've heard anything about psychedelic science, the medical use of psychedelics to treat things like PTSD or drug addiction, most likely MAPS has had a hand in it. They've been at this since the 80s. Just plugging away, and now a lot of this stuff is just starting to come to fruition. We're seeing MDMA in phase 3 FDA clinical trials and many other exciting things that we're going to talk with Rick about. So start asking your questions now, because I really want this entire endeavor is meant to be an interactive experience, but especially this one. I think people out there, if you can come up with good questions, this is prime for interaction. So we'll talk with Rick in just a second. Just to give you a preview of what's coming up on Thursday and Friday. Tomorrow we're going to be talking with Christian O'Brien. He is a writer and creator of the 1791L YouTube channel, which is a couple of young conservative libertarians who put out some really interesting stuff. And we're going to be talking a little bit with him about the future of the right and what it's like to be an independent content creator in the current climate. And that should be pretty interesting. So if I do encourage you, if you're going to join that conversation, go head over to their YouTube channel, 1791L, and take a look at a couple of their videos and come loaded with questions for Christian. And then on Friday, as I've mentioned on every stream so far, we're going to be bringing on Reason's own Nick Gillespie to touch again on a topic that we touched before, which is postmodernism, which has gotten there's been a kind of resurgent interest in that topic that was hot in the 90s, and it's hot again for some reason. And we put out a video about that, and we got some interesting responses that we want to reply to and just solicit more responses as well in real time. And if you want to send questions in advance about that, or for Christian, you can send an email to questions@reason.com. And now let's get right into this conversation with Rick, who's standing by. I'm going to start this off with a clip. I attended with my recent colleague Alex Manning in 2017 the Psychedelic Science Conference in San Francisco. And this brought together researchers from around the world who are studying psychedelics, particularly in a medical context. And it blew my mind. It really did. And this is the documentary that we came away with, or just a little clip, just to give you a sense of what they are doing and what the promise of this is. So we'll play that, and then we'll come right back with Rick Doblin.
There's so many ways to answer the question, why explore psychedelics?
But as everyone knows, I'm called LSD for short.
These drugs get deep into the psyche.
I think the value of psychedelics lies in their potential to be effective treatments for patients who are not responding to conventional treatment.
We should recognize human beings have an urge to change their consciousness.
I often think about it in terms of Dorothy's trip to Oz.
The laws about many substances were passed with total disregard for the evidence.
So now we're at the stage of there's more psychedelic research than any time in the last 50 years.
All right, so that was just the intro. Rick, welcome to the stream.
Thank you for having me.
And that was your voice at the end saying that there's more psychedelic research now than there has been in the past 50 years. Can you just tell us about that and how we arrived at this moment?
Well, there is a psychedelic renaissance that's taking place not just in the United States, but all over the world. And how we got here, basically from the 50s and 60s, there was an incredible interest in psychedelic research, and it was not controversial. It was happening all over the world. It was seen as one of the most important new advances in psychiatry. It really helped lead to the discovery of neurotransmitters in the brain, because people started wondering, how did something as small as LSD have such a profound effect? But then it also got tangled up into the counterculture, and particularly in the United States, with psychedelics being connected to a lot of people who were really protesting the Vietnam War, who were supporting environmental movement, women's rights movement, civil rights movement. And for political reasons, President Nixon sort of tried to clamp down and passed the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. And that basically wiped out psychedelic research in the United States. And also, through our exports, we are exporting drug policy. We wiped it out all over the world. And there was nothing for several decades. And then where we are today really began in 1992 with the FDA formally saying that they were going to reopen the door to psychedelic research. In 1990, they gave permission to Rick Strassman to do a study with DMT. And then in 1992, Charlie Grobe, who was also one of the voices in your documentary, he and I were able to get permission to start research with MDMA. But it was really the FDA and some people there that said it was time for science really to be conducted and time to overcome this political resistance. And so ever since 1992, we've been able to do this research. And the other big thing that it's really been dependent on is private donations, because we've had what you might call a market failure, in the sense that the major psychedelics are off patent in the public domain. Pharmaceutical companies were not interested in working with them. Also, pharmaceutical companies really don't understand psychotherapy, and these were drugs that worked in combination with psychotherapy. And so the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the National Institute of Mental Health, NIH, there was no funding available from those organizations. Major foundations were not supporting this sort of research. And so MAPS, which I started in 1986, and then a group called Hefter Research, which was started in 1993, right after the 92 meetings with FDA, and then Beckley Foundation in England started. So it's really been through the donations of individuals and family foundations that we've been able to sponsor this research. And we're hoping that there'll be more funding from traditional sources. But we are now in this incredible situation of research going on all over the world. The other thing that I'd say really contributed to this is the sad development that normal drugs from big pharma have not been able to address a lot of the mental health issues that are out there in addiction, in depression, in post-traumatic stress disorder. There are drugs that help to some extent, but there's a large number of people that are what are called treatment resistant, that are not able to find the relief that they needed. But then I think there's also been one other major factor, which is spirituality, and that a lot of these psychedelics have been used for thousands of years. There are some new ones like LSD that have just come from the lab, but psilocybin, mescaline from peyote, ayahuasca from plants in Brazil and South America, that these drugs have been used for thousands of years for spirituality and healing, and some kind of combination of both of them. And I think a lot of what's been happening with globalization, with modernity, is that we've lost a certain amount of faith in a lot of the traditional religions and then the traditional rituals and rites of passage. And they haven't had the power that in the past they may have had for helping people have these powerful experiences that we all feel a need for, this connection to the larger world. And psychedelics have been able to provide that for thousands of years. And so despite the efforts of government to suppress this for decades, it really was not successful. And now we have a resurgence. And in fact, what we're trying to do is really show that these drugs, these experiences, are not linked to a counterculture, that they can be integrated into the mainstream and revitalize. And I think that's really the political challenge that we're facing now as we move forward. And we're very close to medicalizing MDMA and other groups psilocybin. So it's a tremendous moment of opportunity at a time of great need.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the government has tried to suppress this for decades, but it's still persisted, and that's largely thanks to MAPS and some of the affiliated groups. So tip of the hat to you for that. And we want to, you mentioned scientists were studying this in the 50s and 60s, and I actually have some archival footage that I came up with from the...
getting acquainted, having all the tests and examinations done to keep them busy for the whole week, day and night practically. The second Monday, we give them a small dose of LSD in the 5-man ward together. This is to help the group pull together and in their group experience during this 26 days to also get some good from this. Then the third Monday, we give them a larger dose individually and have each one of them cared for by one of these teams who have associated with them, and they give them their complete support. And this is where we aim for the so-called psychedelic experience.
Okay, so that was obviously doctors administering LSD to patients. And what exactly, you said it was Nixon coming in the 1970s and cutting it off. What kind of research were they doing back then? Did they make any breakthroughs back then? And did you just kind of, 40, 50 years later, pick up where they left off, or did you go in a completely different direction?
Sorry.
No problem.
Well, basically, we did pick up where they left off. There were major breakthroughs. In many ways, as I said, the discovery of the neurotransmitter systems of serotonin were an outgrowth of the LSD research. LSD is very similar to other substances that act on the serotonin system. But I would say that the major breakthroughs were in the treatment of addiction and in the treatment of people who were facing life-threatening illnesses, who were nervous or anxious or depressed about dying. And the results of those studies were phenomenal. What most people don't know is that Bill Wilson, one of the founders of AA, actually used LSD and found it to be very helpful and thought that it would be something that could play a role in regular Alcoholics Anonymous. And that became controversial, and he basically had to leave AA. But there was tremendous work with heroin addicts, with alcoholics, and a whole range of psychopathologies and psychotherapies. So these drugs were really the most exciting things happening in psychiatry in the 50s and 60s. And it was only the way in which they got tangled up in the counterculture that they got criminalized. And then because a lot of this research is complicated, you need control groups, you need legal contexts. What happened was that the therapeutic use got driven underground. And so there was a long history of this work being conducted still in therapeutic settings despite the laws, but there was never any sort of overview summary of the data. It was really just continually used by small groups of psychiatrists and psychotherapists. And it was out of those groups that all sorts of new drugs were developed, including MDMA. And so that was developed by Sasha Shulgin and others working closely with him, particularly after 1970, when the Controlled Substances Act criminalized a lot of drugs. And then people started tinkering with the molecules to find molecules that were similar but legal and would have somewhat similar effects. And so MDMA was rediscovered in the middle 70s, even though it had been initially invented in 1912 by Merck and forgotten about. They didn't know what they had. They tested it only in animals. And I think there was also an incredible experiment that was done in 1962 that was called the Good Friday experiment. And that was done by Tim Leary at Harvard. Walter Pankey was his PhD student, was a doctor and a minister. And that was an effort to look at whether psychedelics could produce a spiritual experience. And they took 20 divinity students into a Good Friday service here in Boston. And the minister was Reverend Howard Thurman, who was Martin Luther King's mentor. And it was in the basement chapel. 20 divinity students, each got a pill, half had psilocybin, half had placebo. And 9 out of the 20 people had a mystical experience, and 8 out of those 9 had psilocybin. And so that experiment really was considered to be the most important experiment in religion and mysticism that was ever conducted.
Wow.
And I was able, sorry for my dogs in the background. And that was something that was blocked. And 25 years later, in the middle 80s, during this period of time when it was still impossible to do research, I was able to do what's called a follow-up study. And I tracked down the people that were in the study. And they reaffirmed, even in the midst of the Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan escalation of the drug war, that they had a genuine mystical experience, and also that it led them to participate in some of the social justice struggles of the day. Timothy Leary also did an incredible project called the Concord Prison Experiment, which was one where they administered psilocybin to prisoners in prison shortly before they released in order to try to see if they could reduce recidivism. And so that was a very important study. Unfortunately, what they realized is that it's not enough to help people have a profound experience. You need a support group once they get out of prison. And at that point in time, the reaction against Leary, he was kicked out of Harvard in '63, right when they were doing that. And I did roughly a 35-year follow-up to that project, and sadly discovered that the results were presented in a way that was scientifically invalid and basically, you could say, fraudulent. And it didn't really work because they didn't have the support groups. But there was very important research in all different areas in the 50s and 60s. And I think the main thing that people learned was that these are incredible tools. Dr. Stan Grof, who was the researcher from the Czech Republic, one of the early LSD researchers, what he said was that LSD is to the study of the mind what the telescope is to astronomy and the microscope is to biology. And I think that was the enduring legacy of the research in the 50s and 60s, is that we had these tools to understand and reveal the mind. I mean, psychedelic means mind manifesting. And so it was only inevitable that eventually these drugs would come back into scientific research.
Yeah, it's just fascinating to me that there were all these promising little seeds that never really got a chance to sprout because of the drug war. And then you took that and applied a rigorous, first of all, helped people navigate the regulatory maze, and then applied this rigorous framework to it. And really, the big breakthroughs we mentioned at the top so far has been MDMA for PTSD, which is seems to be the furthest along at this point. And I want you to talk about that in a minute. But first, I want to play a clip, because what you're talking about here is psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And I want people to get an idea of what that is by hearing some of the people who are engaging in these studies talk about it. So this is another clip from that same documentary from the Psychedelic Science Conference.
Our group at Harvard, UCLA, and other groups at Hopkins, NYU, elsewhere, also throughout Europe, are beginning to demonstrate that some of the most difficult patients out there do seem to be manifesting a positive response, sometimes to only one treatment session within the context of an ongoing psychotherapy.
The thing that we're talking about with psychedelics is a whole different paradigm. It's psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy where you only get the psychedelics a few times.
One thing that helped me understand the nature of what we're doing is when I kind of stepped away from the notion that they're really drug studies. We have the language and the tools and the systems for studying drugs, but what we're actually studying, the therapeutic benefit in theory, comes from experiencing an altered state of consciousness for a limited period of time.
It's like everything is falling apart. My eyes are an electronic microscope, and I can see just all the atoms and everything.
I often think about it in terms of Dorothy's trip to Oz. There she was in black and white Kansas going along. Things seemed fine, but when she was suddenly transformed by riding that tornado to Oz and landed in the world with a yellow brick road, an emerald city, and a horse of a different color, and all sorts of interesting characters, she must have been changed as a result of that experience. But at the end of the day, there's no place like home, and she comes back to where she started, and all the same people are there. She's back in her home, in her own bed, but you can bet that she's been changed from that experience of having been to Oz.
So have you seen that in practice with these trials, this idea where you only need to do it one or two times and then the person is more or less recovered from the condition?
We have seen that. I mean, our standard model is 3 MDMA sessions, 1 month apart, and those are 8-hour sessions with a male-female co-therapy team, but that's supplemented by 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 in preparation once a week for the first MDMA session, and then 3 90-minute sessions after each MDMA session for integration. But to just give you an example, one of the veterans that was in our study that had PTSD for years and years after having served in Iraq, in just one session, he was able to be cured. And what he said happened to him was that while he was under the influence of MDMA, which reduces people's emotional fear response to painful memories, that he realized that there was something beneficial to him from having PTSD, and that was a way in which he was expressing his loyalty to the friends of his that had died. And he was able to see that there was this benefit to him, that this was an important expression of loyalty. And then he looked at himself from the eyes of the friends of his that had died. And he realized that from their perspective, they would want him to live, that they no longer had that opportunity to live. They had died. But they wouldn't want him to waste his life in post-traumatic stress disorder, and he was disabled, unable to work, reminded constantly of the fear, the trauma, the scary, frightful things that happened, that they would want him to use the precious life gift that he had to live as fully as he could, and that the best way he could show loyalty to his friends that died was not to be disabled from PTSD, but to live as fully as possible. And then he said to himself, all right, what do I do with the rest of my life? And in that moment, he healed himself. And then he said to himself, I'm actually taking opiates for pain, and I don't think I'm really taking them for pain. I think I'm taking them for escape, and I don't need them anymore. And I'm going to stop the opiates. And then he said, I don't really need the MDMA anymore. I'm going to stop that, and I want to drop out of the study. I'm cured. And we said to him, it's entirely voluntary that you stay in the study, but would you be willing to at least do the outcome measures at 2 months and 1 year? And he agreed to do that. And at 2 months and 1 year, he had no PTSD. He was below the level of symptoms to be diagnosed as PTSD.
Wow.
So I don't want to give everybody the impression, though, that these are one-dose miracle cures. This was a rare circumstance. Most people need several sessions. But even then, what we've shown is that in our phase 2 studies, where we've worked with 107 people, And we do follow-ups at 2 months after the last experimental session and also 1 year after. 2/3 of people who had severe, chronic, treatment-resistant PTSD, on average, 2/3 of them no longer have a diagnosis of PTSD 1 year after the last session.
Wow.
It's absolutely remarkable. And a lot of the 1/3 that still has a diagnosis of PTSD have clinically significant reductions in symptoms. So it doesn't work for everybody, but the psychedelics, in a very profound way, in a relatively short period of time, can help people reprogram their brains. Actually, in some brain scans that we've been doing, it demonstrates that people's brains are rewired in certain ways, away from these hyperactive fear processing centers of the brain. And you can take memories that are sort of stuck in short-term memory. It's like the trauma is always about to happen, or it's always happening, and people are always scared about that, but they can process them as part of their life, as part of their history, but put it into long-term memory. So there are remarkable therapeutic potentials from psychedelics when combined with psychotherapy.
Yeah, and I guess that is the paradigm shift here, is that in psychiatry right now, it's kind of like you get the prescription for Zoloft or whatever, and then you're on that for the rest of your life, possibly.
Right.
And this is, whether it is 2 times or 5 or 7, the idea is eventually you might not need it anymore because it's getting at something deeper inside the brain, or as you're saying, like rewiring. Yeah.
Well, you could say that it's a fundamental difference is, are you treating symptoms or are you treating the causes? And what we feel with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is that we're actually getting down to the cause, the trauma, and helping people process that. Whereas most traditional psychiatric medicines can reduce the symptoms, but they're just palliative. They don't address the causes. If you stop taking the pills, the problems come back. You get a bunch of side effects from the pills themselves. And so this maybe helps it for the listeners to understand why these psychedelics are being developed by nonprofit organizations as compared to for-profit pharmaceutical companies. Because what we're trying to do is make it so people are independent of these drugs and independent of the therapy, that we do in short, intensive work to try to help people be independent, rather than try to give them drugs that are just palliative for months or years or lifetime.
And you mentioned earlier the early studies that were studying kind of the religious experience or spiritual experiences that people have under these when they take psychedelics. And there's a question here about that from El Silva, who asks, why do psychedelics mostly create mystical, religious-like experiences? Do you have any insight on that question? Have we found anything scientifically?
Yes. Well, one of the things that has changed since the early work in the 50s and 60s is the incredible advance in technology for brain scans, and all sorts of ways in which we can have a better understanding of what the psychedelics do in the mind when they're actively doing it. And so one of the big discoveries has been through what's called the understanding of, this is actually what I was going to talk about. So what's called the default mode network. It's basically the resting state of your brain. And the default mode network is somewhat equivalent to what we might know psychologically as the ego. It's like, what do we need for our own survival, for our own work, for our relationships, so we're sort of scanning the environment for how does it relate to us as an individual in this body at this time. And what that does is it's a filter of all the information that's coming into us from all of our senses and from all of our unconscious. And that's filtered for sort of our ego. What do we need to do for our own personal benefit, you could say. And what the classic psychedelics, MDMA does not do this, but the classic psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, ayahuasca, ibogaine, they reduce activity in the default mode network in the filtering system of the brain. And so you get a broader flow of information into your awareness. And what it also does, if you think about it as there's a membrane between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And at night in dreaming, we all have this weakening of the membrane that more unconscious material, fears, emotions, ideas come to the surface in dreams in imaginative ways. And then when things could get difficult, then people can, emotionally difficult, people wake up. With psychedelics, that it has that same aspect. Stan Groff, again, mentions that LSD is a non-specific amplifier of the unconscious, that it just brings what's emotionally most relevant to the people at the time in this kind of inner healing intelligence, wisdom process of what comes to the surface of awareness. But you can't wake up under psychedelics. You have to learn how to process it. And so we have a pretty good understanding of how psychedelics work. What we don't really know is, why do certain emotions or certain ideas or certain memories come to the surface at any particular time. There's this understanding that we all know that our bodies are self-regulating, self-healing systems, that physically we get hurt, our body repairs itself. And there's some kind of similar mechanism in the brain, in the psyche, in the ego, in the mind, that emotionally, that somehow or other, there's a self-healing mechanism in the brain, and that there's this inner intelligence about what we need to deal with to really process and to move that healing. And so we have this sort of supportive, inner-directed therapeutic method in the sense that it's not scripted what happens during an LSD session or during an MDMA session. We support what's emerging, and we have this basic belief that there is this kind of inner healing wisdom, and we support what's coming up. And so we know also physiologically very precisely which receptor sites in the brain, which classic psychedelics act on. It's the serotonin 2A receptor sites that produces a lot of the visual effects, and also produces this flow of imagery and a different way of processing. There's been incredible work with MDMA with brain scans, and so we know it acts differently than the classic psychedelics. And what it does is it reduces activity in the amygdala, which is the fear processing part of the brain. It increases activity in the frontal cortex, which is where we think rationally and logically, and it also increases connectivity between the hippocampus and the amygdala, which is where memories are moved out to from short-term to long-term storage, which is the opposite of what PTSD does. PTSD reduces activity in the frontal cortex, so we don't think as logically. It increases activity in the amygdala, so people's fear reactions are hyperstimulated, and also it reduces connectivity with long-term memory with the hippocampus and the amygdala. So MDMA in a way reverses the kind of brain changes that PTSD produces in PTSD sufferers. It also stimulates the hormones oxytocin and prolactin, which are hormones of nursing mothers, of love, of bonding, and it stimulates serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. So I think we have an increasingly good understanding of what psychedelics do in the brain and in the whole system. And that helps people to understand when we say that these have such incredible therapeutic potential. We're able to also use brain scans to demonstrate how people's brains function before and after treatment.
It's a fascinating time for this to be happening, because back in the 50s and 60s, we didn't have all the tools of neuroscience that we have now. And that slide that I put up earlier right here is from the Beckley Foundation in England. And one of the professor who conducted that study is Dr. David Nutt, who happened to be the former drug czar in England, who had a change of heart. So he has an interesting story. I'd love to get him on the live stream at some point. But I interviewed him at the conference as well, and he had some things to say about psychedelics and the study of things like creativity or consciousness itself. And so I want to play just a little bit of Professor Nutt, and then have you talk a little bit more about those topics.
they can be disrupted by LSD. And LSD basically makes the brain much more connected. Parts of the brain which haven't been allowed to talk to each other for 30, 40 years can talk to each other again. Huge amount of crosstalk. So we call this the entropic brain, or the much more flexible brain. And we think that's what underlies the experiences that people have during the trip. We've got good evidence for that. But also explains why afterwards people often feel different and better, because they've been allowed to, actually the brain's been allowed to work in a slightly different way for the first time, perhaps ever.
So whoever thought that these drugs, which were portrayed as just things that hippies do, would actually be able to be used by scientists to study things like different states of consciousness and obviously treating the maladies we've been talking about. I mean, what kind of potential do you think they have in that realm of looking, because it's interesting that we're talking about this on a live stream, because, you know, it's almost like I could put some sort of different encoder on this stream and you would see the stream coming through in a pixelated, weird way. And that's kind of the same way consciousness is. It's the stream, and then the psychedelics are the disruptor there, and that seems to open up some research opportunities.
Oh, an enormous amount of research opportunities. You know, back in the 80s, in the late 80s, early 90s, when after MDMA was criminalized, there was a lot of concern about supposed brain damage and the effect on the serotonin system. And the only way that we could really look at it at that point in time was through spinal taps, was trying to look at serotonin metabolites and other neurotransmitter metabolites in the spinal fluid. So I've actually gotten 2 spinal taps to look at my own brain, and also recruited about 30 other people to do some of these spinal tap studies. And, you know, they're not as precise or as accurate as the modern brain scan studies. You know, there's going to be a project at Yale that's actually going to take PTSD sufferers, give them MDMA and stick them in a brain scanner, and then expose them to what's called a trauma script of their trauma and a neutral script, and see how they process that information. So we've had healthy volunteers have taken MDMA and gone into brain scanners, and we've scanned people with PTSD before and after therapy with MDMA, but there's never been the opportunity yet, but there will be soon at Yale, to take people who have PTSD, give them MDMA and stick them in a scanner and see how acutely they actually process information and emotions in a different way. And then maybe they'll even learn something that will help us improve how we do therapy. I think there's been incredible studies. One of the favorite ones that I'll mention is in Switzerland, and it's taking lifelong meditators, Zen meditators. And what they do is they go to the University of Zurich for brain scans to see how they process and see how their brains work when they're meditating. Then they go to a 6-day meditation retreat at a place called Fell Center in Lucerne. And during that retreat, in the middle of it, they get a pill, and it's either psilocybin or a placebo. And they take that while they're meditating, and it's a significant amount of it. And then they're looking at it afterwards to how did that affect their meditation practice? How did that affect their altruism, empathy, and compassion? And they also go to brain scans afterwards to see if there's any permanent changes in how they process emotions and thoughts. So we're able to actually start looking at spirituality, meditation, therapy in ways that only recently have we had these modern tools to do so. And so I think that if we really can succeed in mainstreaming psychedelics, and we anticipate that MDMA will be a medicine approved by the FDA and in 2021. And we're anticipating for the European Medicine Agency probably 2022. And other groups are trying to do this for psilocybin. And so we think 2021, 2022, psilocybin will be available. And also we look at ketamine. Ketamine is considered one of the most important discoveries in neuroscience and psychotherapy in the last 20, 30 years, because ketamine is now being used for depression. It was an anesthetic in the 60s, but now it's being used for suicidal refractory depression. So there's great hope in the therapeutic potential, but also in really understanding how they are processed in the brain. But I will say one thing that's different between MDMA and the classic psychedelics. So in the work in the 50s and 60s with LSD and psilocybin for opiate addicts, alcoholics, cancer patients, in the current work with psilocybin for a whole range of addictions and depression and anxiety, there's a direct correlation between the depth of the mystical experience and their therapeutic outcomes. And where David Nutt was talking about a different way of processing, the brain is connecting parts that weren't normally connected. That's the essence of the mystical experience, is a sense that it's all connected. We're all part of one larger system. You get out of your narrow ego sense and you see the big sweep of history, of evolution. We're all connected in certain ways. That the therapy is often focused on helping people go to beyond ego states of mind. However, with MDMA, which doesn't really dissolve the ego in that way, doesn't impact the default mode network, it just reduces fear response to difficult emotions, that we use the same measures of mystical experience. And we find that people do score fairly high with MDMA, but we found there is no correlation between the mystical experience and therapeutic outcomes for MDMA for PTSD. Huh. And I think why that is that people need to revisit the trauma from their biography from a position of safety, from a position of being able to remember, bring repressed memories to the surface, look at them, understand them, not panic from them, and then put them into long-term memory storage. And so that's where people need to be more grounded in their MDMA experiences, in their biography, and there's a different therapeutic mechanism. And MDMA, by being the most gentle of the psychedelics and the most similar to normal processing, it just feels like people can process clearer, that it's the easier to integrate. It's the easier to take those lessons into one's daily life. And so because of that, I think MDMA, the reason it's the first through the system is because it is the gentlest and it's the easiest for therapists and patients to work with.
Yeah, and on the other end of the spectrum, and there's some questions coming in about legalization and what that pathway looks like, and I definitely want to talk about that in just a minute, but I want to ask about one of the other studies that intrigued me had to do with psilocybin mushrooms being administered to people with a terminal illness. Yeah. And the findings seem to be that it actually decreased death anxiety. Could you just talk about that finding and why you think that might be happening?
Yeah. Well, let me also say that we were able to start LSD research for the first time in 35 years. And it was in Switzerland, and it was for people with life-threatening illnesses who were anxious about dying. We were also able to start research at Harvard, where Timothy Leary was, and that was with MDMA for cancer patients with anxiety. And so the psilocybin work is part of that stream of research to work with people who are having a life-threatening illness, cancer, and are anxious and fearful of dying. So I'd say the first thing that makes it so therapeutic is that the fears and anxieties that people have come to the surface and you could work with them. So what we find is that those people who have a life-threatening illness and have depression or anxiety because of it, their focus of their attention is on their illness and on what they're not going to have. The fact that they're not going to be able to predict a long life, that they're going to have a shorter lifespan. What they've lost is what they're focused on. And with the psilocybin, it helps them realize what they have now, that they're still alive, and that they can use their life as fully as possible. Also, part of this mystical experience is what's called the transcendence of time and space, the sense of being connected to some sort of eternal thing. Now, we know this in physics. We know energy is not created or destroyed. We know that there's 13, 14 billion years of history, that we're just here, each of us individually, for a blip of time. But we get so wrapped in the present, wrapped in our mind. And so under the influence of psilocybin, these cancer patients have been able to both process the fears and anxieties about their illness, but also touch into this spiritual sense of being part of this long sweep of history. And that's what gives them a sense of peace often. And it also gets them into the here and now, so that in the here and now they're alive. In their minds, they're all thinking about what's going to happen when they die. They're going to get worse. Their illness is going to proceeding to get worse. They're sort of anticipating. They're not living in the present. And if anything, psychedelics bring you to the moment. And so I think that's a big part of their healing potential. And with psychotherapy, those experiences can have lasting impacts. Only one experience sometimes gives people a new perspective, and then they don't ever forget that perspective. And then there's something fundamentally interesting that I don't think we really understand fully, which is how these psychedelic experiences are encoded in memory. When I did the 35-year follow-up to the Concord prison experiment with psilocybin and the 25-year follow-up to the Good Friday experiment also with psilocybin, people had a very vivid memory of parts of their psychedelic experiences. After all these years, if I were to talk to you about what movies you saw 25 years ago, even movies that you loved, the memories of these psychedelic experiences, portions of them are just intensely imprinted on our brains in some ways that I don't think we really fully understand yet. But they have a profound impact. So when we think about the work with psilocybin with death anxiety, I think it's got incredible potential. The hospice movement will eventually be using psychedelics to help people near the very end of life. I think when people are newly diagnosed with life-threatening illnesses, it would be great for them to have a psychedelic experience to prepare for the surgery or chemotherapy or whatever they're going to get, but also to help them with their lives. And then also we think about their family members, that it doesn't just affect them, it affects the people all around them. So you said there were some questions about legalization, both for medical use and non-medical use. But I think what we're going to find is that we're going to be working with patients, but we will then expand to their families who are not technically the patients, but are still suffering, and then we'll expand into the larger society.
Yeah, it seems as if once this evidence becomes more and more firmly established, these things, it's just going to make sense to more and more people for these things to be integrated into society and mainstreamed, as you put it earlier. And people are asking here how you think that might play out. One person, Jason P., says, what do you think the possibility of recreational legalization is, and what kind of positive or negative consequences could it have? And then there's another one down here. There's a current push to gather enough signatures for a ballot initiative to move forward this summer in Denver. This is from Case 12, to decriminalize psilocybin, and another for the whole state of Oregon. Do initiatives like this potentially reduce the likelihood of the population accepting the therapeutic benefits of MDMA and other psychedelics? So I guess that is really the heart of both of these questions is, does recreational legalization make sense, or is that just going to undermine all the work that you've done to make this, medically acceptable?
Well, I think it's interesting that we're having this discussion today, since yesterday the Senate passed a major criminal justice reform bill. And hopefully the House will pass it and President Trump will sign it. So I think what we've seen in general over the last several decades is a reevaluation of the whole criminalization of drugs and the drug war, and that it's been a resounding failure. It's been one of the most important failures in American policy that we've exported all over the world. It's really been a tragedy. And so there's a reevaluation of that, also going along with the reevaluation of the proper policy structures for marijuana. And so we see growing acceptance of the legalization of marijuana. Now, I've seen polling data that was just sent to me the other day that had to do with exactly what we're talking about, decriminalization or legalization of psilocybin or other drugs. And what it turns out is that when you ask people, are you sympathetic with decriminalizing drugs, you'll get a majority, roughly, I think it was about 60%. Right now it's about 64% for legalizing marijuana. But you talk about decrim of all drugs and fines instead of jail, it's around 60%. However, when you ask the same question, but you put in the names of the drugs, are you sympathetic with the decriminalization of drugs like LSD, heroin, cocaine, MDMA? roughly 20 points of support drops away. So when people anchor in their minds to specific drugs, they're less willing to support decriminalization. So what I think that means in terms of the initiative in Denver, the initiative in Oregon to try to focus specifically on psilocybin, that those are not going to pass and that there's not enough support for them. The other thing, so I think that at least initially, I think broader decrim for all drugs, you might think that's more controversial and less likely to succeed, but I think it's actually more likely to succeed. So I'm very sympathetic more with broad decriminalization. And I think that when you target specific drugs, particularly psilocybin or LSD or MDMA, that the support drops way down. Now, the thing about marijuana, what has happened with marijuana is that we have had roughly 22 years since 1996, which was the first state medical marijuana initiatives in California and Arizona. And we've had a preceding 22 years has been the expansion of medical use of marijuana. With medical dispensaries for marijuana, people can see that you can regulate them in different ways and they're not violence prone. The societies don't crumble. The drug use by young people doesn't go up. It's just been roughly several decades of medicalization that has caused people to see these drugs, the risk-benefit ratio in different ways, and to come to different conclusions about how the proper policies should be. So I think that what we need to do is medicalize psychedelics for 10 or 15 years before decrim or legalization of those drugs specifically will be passed, that there'll be majority support for that. So what we anticipate is 2021, we get medical use of MDMA. Then we're going to set up thousands of psychedelic clinics throughout the United States where people are going to be able to go for MDMA, eventually psilocybin, ketamine, what other drugs, hopefully ibogaine for the treatment of opiate addiction will follow on, and we'll be able to really start helping people understand that the residual fears that they have, that they've been told from decades and decades and billions of dollars of anti-drug propaganda, that is not really the full story. And I think, so my sense is that the efforts to do initiatives for psilocybin are not going to hurt our work at all. In fact, they'll help it, even when they fail, because they're trying to raise a conversation about these drugs and the value of these drugs. And they also make it so that medicalization then becomes not the farthest out thing. It's now more conservative. We're now the conservative wing of this drug reform movement because we're just talking about medicalizing and doing the science and working with FDA. And you have all these people that are trying to decriminalize. So I don't think it'll hurt. I think it'll help. But I do think that it's not likely to pass. And what we really should be focusing on from a political perspective is building on the support for legalization of marijuana, the criminal justice system reforms that are going through, focusing not on prevention through criminalization and fear, but through honest drug education and support for treatment on demand. And I think that those are the shifts that we're going to be seeing over the next decade or two with drug policy. And
in addition to, if you're the conservative wing and the decrim people are the progressive wing, this man that I'm about to show a clip of might be the radical wing, George Burke, who microdoses LSD. This has become more of it, and he's open about it. This has become an emerging trend in places like Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is known for experimentation with psychedelics. Steve Jobs famously said that without LSD, there might be no Apple. So I want to just show this clip about microdosing and then get your thoughts on what kind of the cultural element of this is in terms of mainstreaming acceptance of psychedelics. So here's just a clip from my interview with George Burke.
I decided to openly talk about microdosing because I had no idea how positively it would have affected my life.
George Burke is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur working in the field of mind and body experimentation. Every morning before he goes to work, he consumes a tiny bit of LSD, about 1/10 as strong as a typical dose.
With microdosing, I don't really feel any effects. I don't know that I've really taken it, other than I notice that my brain seems to be able to solve problems a little bit better than I was before.
Burke has calibrated his dose so that it merely tweaks his perception and doesn't interfere with everyday tasks. He's part of an increasingly popular trend called microdosing.
And I'm feeling a little more connected, both to my work and to the people that I need to talk to on a given day. Let me tell you about the first time that I did LSD microdosing. I had a big task I needed to take care of, putting together a large business contingency plan. It would have been difficult to think about each contingency and incubate it and put it on paper. This was going to be a very large document that I was putting together. After microdosing, what I was able to do, and this just intuitively came to me, was to envision each contingency as branches of a tree. And I could picture each one as a branch, and I could visually climb this tree and reach out to one branch, grab that idea, incubate it, write it down, and then place it back up, and then go to the next branch. And I could do that all throughout the entire tree. And it was a very interesting way to visually solve what would have been a very complicated problem to do otherwise.
And I'll mention that there was a microdosing panel at the conference I attended, and it was probably the most attended panel. So there's a lot of interest in this concept of just taking a little bit to tweak your perception rather than having an all-out trip. So what are your general thoughts on microdosing?
Well, Albert Hofmann, who invented LSD, was incredible man. He lived to 102. He died in 2008. And shortly before he died, he told me that one of the most important areas of research with LSD that had not really been done was microdosing. So he was very aware of the different properties at different dose levels. And I think that there's a way in which microdosing can offer enhanced creativity. We heard about the imagery, how people think. It's got an enormous potential. There's people that also use it for depression, to just give a little bit of energy. But I think, those people that I know that do that occasionally supplement that with large full doses to try to get not so much at the symptoms, but also at the root causes. But I think for creativity, when we look at what we think is one of the main competitive advantages of America around the world, it's creativity, it's free thinking. And I think that microdosing really fits right into that. And we also think about Silicon Valley. I mean, it's very much a popular substance used, microdosing in Silicon Valley, but all sorts of creativity, artists. I think it's very brave for someone to say that they do an illegal drug like that and to be able to be supported, promoted that. And, I think the DEA at this stage has got its hands full with the incredible, terrible opiate epidemic. Last year, more people died of drug overdoses in 1 year. More Americans died of drug overdoses last year than died in the entire Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan wars. And so they're not really going after microdosers or ayahuasca circles. They've got bigger problems, and so I think we're able to have people step out without as much fear to explain what they're doing. And I think that microdosing is definitely one of the most important areas of research, and people are getting a lot of benefits from it. And I think it's also from a society-wide level. There's been a lot of fear of that losing control with LSD, of letting the mind go. And microdosing is a way to help people go a tiny bit in that way and understand more how LSD works. You get a tiny bit of that direction. The advantage of microdosing, too, is that you can learn how to do that on your own without the drug, too. It gives... it's education that you can remember and bring back to your daily life. The same way as in therapy. We try to do a few doses so you learn and process emotional experiences, but you don't need to keep doing the drug. I think a lot of people find with microdosing that it has long-term effects, even when they're not microdosing, in terms of how to think in a more creative way. I will add that not so much microdosing, but low doses of MDMA, we found paradoxically with PTSD patients is not helpful in that it gives them a stimulation, but it doesn't reduce the fear enough. And so they actually are very uncomfortable, and people have dropped out of our studies in the low dose groups. And so it really depends on from drug to drug, and also from condition to condition. Healthy people who do small doses don't have to deal with that kind of trauma. They can be actually more open to it. I think it's an incredible area that the sadness is that it's also been one of those things suppressed for many, many decades, and it's only now recently becoming something that we're looking at more. Incredible amount of lost potential, an incredible amount of unnecessary suffering over the last couple decades because of the drug war. And I'll just say that Reason has been so fantastic on what you guys do in terms of the drug war and in terms of fundamental human rights. We haven't really discussed that, but I think that if you look at the Bill of Rights and you look at the freedom of religion, the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, that the freedom of speech, that underlying all of those is the freedom of thought, the freedom to explore our consciousness, and that the drug war is a fundamental violation of core human rights, that we shouldn't block people from having certain ideas or certain experiences. We should be focused more on performance, on how they act, and punish or reward accordingly, rather than on what drugs people ingest or how they change their consciousness. And we actually, if we look at the first time that the sort of conquistadors came into North America, one of the things that they did at the very beginning was suppress the use of peyote. So the drug war isn't just started from Nixon in 1970. The drug war really began at the very beginning of the colonization of North America by going after those people that use psychedelics. And also the longest running mystery ceremonies using psychedelics in the history of the world that we're aware of is the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece. And they went from around 1600 BC to around 396 AD. And they were wiped out by the Catholic Church. And they were another way for people to have direct access to spirituality. And then you got hierarchical structures that want to be the mediator between you and God, you and spirituality. And so the drug war has a long history in Western culture. And for us now in this crisis stage of globalization, of global warming, of cultures coming together, of the need to move beyond fundamentalism, these tools that have been historically important to us but have been suppressed are coming to the fore again at a time of great need. And I think we'll be able to successfully use these to really help in the struggle for human survival.
I don't think we're going to top that. You're talking about, everyone's heard of freedom of conscience, and you're talking about freedom of consciousness, which is a beautiful note to end on, I think. So I want to thank you, Rick Doblin, for taking the time to talk to us and explain what is happening with psychedelics. It's an exciting few years ahead, it sounds like. 2021, you mentioned you expect MDMA might be on the market to treat PTSD, and we'll see what happens next. And thank you to everyone again who tuned in for this. We'll be back tomorrow at our nighttime schedule, which is 7 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, with Christian O'Brien of 1791L's YouTube channel. Again, if you're going to tune into that, I encourage you to go head over there and watch a couple of their videos. I think it'll enhance the experience a little bit. And we'll be talking about the future of the right. If you have any questions for him ahead of time, or for Nick Gillespie about postmodernism on Friday, you can email us at questions@reason.com. For now, we'll head out and see you tomorrow. Thanks.